Thanks everyone for being here on the last day for the last session. There's only 90 minutes to go. I've had a really great time learning about all of your research over the past couple of days, and now I get to ask some questions to the people joining me on the panel today. I'm Oliver Hanney. I'm the managing editor of VoxDev, which is a website that basically tries to make research more accessible. Looking around, I can see a lot of people in here who've already written for us, and hopefully a lot more to come. And I'm joined today on the panel by Ranil Dissanayake, who's the Deputy Chief Economist at FCDO. And then on my left is Miriam, who's the Senior Research Advisor at GiveDirectly. And then we have Justice Mensah on the end, who is the Senior Economist at the World Bank Africa's Chief Economist Office. And then we have Nompumelelo Nyathi-Mohohlwane, who is an education researcher at the National Department of Basic Education in South Africa. So the goal of today's panel is to try and provide some kind of actionable insights based on everyone here's experiences working across research and policy, and get to the bottom of, or at least make an attempt to see how researchers can produce better evidence, communicate it effectively, and how policymakers can create an environment that values and demands evidence. So in terms of the structure, we're going to start off with something a bit different, so hopefully it works. I'm going to give everyone a statement, and then I'm going to ask them on a scale of 1 to 10 how much they agree with it. So 1 being they really disagree, 10 being they really agree. Hopefully people don't all just say 5 and sit on the fence. And then once we've done that, they'll expand on their answers a bit for about 5 minutes. We'll go through everyone. Then I'm going to have some questions following up on that. And then, I mean, we've got 90 minutes, so there's going to be loads of time for everyone here to ask questions if they have any. So I'll get straight into it and start with Justice. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how much did you agree with this statement? The biggest bottleneck to evidence-based policymaking in Africa is not a lack of research, but the limited demand for evidence amongst policymakers.
Am I supposed to grade? Okay, 4.99999.
On the fence.
Look, I think we all know it's what we have, particularly in development economics. It's a suboptimal outcome, right? I'll call it a suboptimal equilibrium in the sense that both sides are to blame. On the policy side, I think there's very little. Well, maybe let me choose my words carefully. There's little demand for research, partly due to a couple of factors, right? And I'm going to go, if you allow me, spend a bit of time on that. So I think it's a combination of the supply and demand side issues. Let me start off with the supply side, and basically almost everybody, 99.99% of the people here are on the supply side. Look, we are all economists, right? And we all respond to incentives, and I think the incentives in academia, it's at the moment it's such that there's very little reward for thinking about policy relevance of your research, right? You know, the identification, wave in the field is such that we have become overly obsessed with microlization, right? And so we kind of take topics or things that are very micro and very limited, right? That we can have a lot of control over. And I see Mike is looking at me. Not that I have anything against Mike, he's a great colleague, but the RCT revolution that we all like, right? The causal stuff, it's great because with that we can control a lot of things, right? To make sure that we have clean identification and the journal editors are happy with us. But to a large extent, I dare say majority of the questions we answer are not relevant for policymakers. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. And the reason is that I think the real world is different from the lot of control experiment that we are all used to, because part of the reason is also because we are also reviewers, right? When we get a paper, we want to tear the paper up and down just to make sure that everything fits. And so economists respond to incentives, and so we kind of want to focus on things that we have a lot of control over. And the implication is that we often ignore the big picture question, the big questions that confront a lot of policymakers. Now, let's use CSAE as an example. The title of this conference is what? CSAE Conference on African Development, right? And I dare say, if we were to do an experiment in a room, to do a quiz, what is name two or three big issues that are confronting policymakers in the region? Mm-hmm. What would that be? On top of my mind is really the apparent low growth in Africa, right? GDP per capita growth in the region over the past 2 or 3 decades, it's near zero. Now, let's take a look at the papers that is presented in this conference. What is the share of the papers that are actually looking at things that is related to the core drivers of growth in Africa? I haven't done that, but I think we can all do it, right? Mm-hmm. And so on the supply side, I think it looks as if that we ourselves, a lot of us are not really answering the questions that are really relevant for a lot of these policymakers. Now, I say that, and I know Stefan will be looking at me, and Stefan and I agree on one thing. It is not every research that has to be relevant for policy. But I think in development economics, we also have a duty to make sure that a lot of our knowledge really influence policy. What would be the point if 20, 30 years ago, 20, 30 years from now, we're still running the same type of experiments, answering the same type of questions? Then it means that none of our work has really impacted, development in the region. So I think, going back to my point, part of it is because of the incentive mechanism in in academia. Now, I'm not saying that the blame is really only on the supply side. On the demand side too, there are a lot of issues. Right? Now, part of it is because I don't think majority of the policymakers in the region have come to really appreciate the value of research and how research can help them to really do their work well. I'm not saying all of them, but I think majority of them. And so I've had an experience where you sit down, you talk to some policymakers, and they kind of see people doing research as people who only think abstract things, right? And so if there's a way in which we can, kind of in a way educate these policymakers to know that there is value for coordinating or more or less working with researchers to be able to help you answer a lot of the questions that are facing them. Now, the brighter side is that gradually we are seeing a lot of people with PhDs that are venturing into government, right? Going to government positions. And from my own experience, when you talk to somebody with a PhD or with a good master's degree, their thinking of research is different from a lot of quote unquote old folks who probably have a different mentality about research. The other part also is that oftentimes these policymakers want answers quickly, right? So sometimes they really want to, there's a demand from the powers that be that find me an answer to a given issue. And we all know how long it takes to publish an average econ paper, right? Probably upwards of 2 years, right? And sometimes the policymakers don't have that luxury for you to say you want to cross all the T's and I've even forgotten what the rest of the adage says, right? And so sometimes this mismatch between the time that these policymakers want and the luxury that we as researchers want to have often create a lot of the issue. Now, the other aspect is that sometimes, and related to the first point, it's very difficult for researchers to convince some of these policymakers. And I have a personal experience. I have an RCT that is going on in Ghana for the past 4 years, of which I have given up on. And part of it was because I really want to answer a very important policy issue. Well, and it's a project with the Electricity Company of Ghana. We all know a lot of the issues that they are going through. They claim that they understand that the issue is important. But upon hindsight, I'm not convinced that they really understand it, because the amount of bureaucratic hurdles that we have had to go through, right? I personally have given up, although my co-authors have not given up. But I think to me, it's more or less like a failed project. And so these kind of, in a way, discourage the few researchers who really want to do a lot of policy and relevant stuff. Now, I'm trying to end, but someone might say, this guy is just ranting around. What exactly are you saying? The point I'm trying to say is that, yes, there's a big issue. And I think that's the main reason why we've gathered here. But the blame it's on both sides. And I think it is important for us all, and I believe there are a lot of donors in the room, international organizations, to really take a step back and say, the status quo cannot continue. We need to find a way in which we bridge this gap between, the policymakers and the researchers. How do we encourage a lot more policy relevant research? I think yesterday or the day before, there was a presentation here about a data lab that is being developed in South Africa. And you see examples in all over the place. VoxDev is here. They try to summarize a lot of the abstract research we do in a way in which that it's relevant for policymakers, because mind you, they don't have access to Elsevier. They don't have access to, the American Economic Review. And so I think all the stakeholders have a role to play to ensure that the good research that is being put out there, it's summarized in a way that is accessible to the policymakers. And I see that I have a red card, so let me shut up.
Yeah, thank you. So kind of on one of the topics that you were just talking about timing, is the subject of my statement for Ranil. So on a scale of 1 to 10, not 4.99999, how much do you agree with this? So policymakers only pay attention to evidence during specific windows and moments. Outside of those, even good research is overlooked.
Well, 5.1. Sorry. No. I'll give that a solid 7 because I agree with it more than I disagree with it. But let me explain it. Basically, policymakers are a broad group. Someone is always listening. Someone is always reading your stuff somewhere. It might be one fairly junior civil servant somewhere, but they're reading your paper. So they are always listening. Whether or not it's actually going to change something is a completely different question. And I think the thing to remember is that policy is very difficult to influence by design. And that's a feature and not a bug of the system. You don't want a policy-making process that changes tack every time someone publishes a new paper. You don't want a policy-making process that sort of listens to every semi-eminent person who comes in, sort of gets an audience with the minister. Right, that would be a bad policy-making process, and sadly, one which many places I've worked in have some resemblance to, in some ways. But so the first thing is that, it is rightly difficult to change a policymaker's mind. It's extremely difficult to change a policymaker's mind with one piece of research or one piece of advice. But the other reason is that 80% of what most governments do is not making decisions. It is just plowing ahead with the delivery of stuff that has already been decided. And, if you think about most countries, their education systems, their health systems, and all of the sort of basic services they provide, like collecting rubbish and so on, most of that is just basically a system that works well enough and that doesn't require a great deal of attention. And that will just perpetuate. It will just keep going on and on and on until it breaks, until something happens that shows that there is some weakness in the system that really must be addressed. Right? So Herbert Simon wrote 50, 60 years ago that attention is always the scarce resource in large organizations. And this is absolutely right. So to change something requires attention. It requires attention from a lot of people and requires a lot of effort. Large organizations have very little attention space. So this is why the timing thing really matters. Because if you can get in at that moment where someone is paying attention and there is an opportunity to change something, there's a logical break in some sort of cycle, a funding agreement is about to be renewed or something, then you have a chance. But it's still only just a chance. And the other time, people are listening, people are reading it, but it's hard to change a system that is chugging along. The last thing I'll say, because I don't want to get the red card on this, is that so when I say that you can influence a policymaker, it also depends on the question that a policymaker is always asking is not sort of what is the marginal impact of increasing the size of a cash transfer by 20% on X or Y. The question is actually much simpler. It's what should I do? And that's not something that many researchers are comfortable answering. Researchers don't tend to say, well, what you should do is this. That's based on my best reading of the evidence and my experience, etc. And so some researchers are comfortable saying that. And it's not always that they are selected with it's not always that the people who are most comfortable giving that kind of propositional advice are also the people who are most across the evidence and most unbiased and so on. But so I guess I'll just close with this. You've got to be at the right time. You've got to be propositional. And you've got to be, I guess, lucky, because it's hard to change big systems, hard to get big organizations to do things.
Great. And yeah, reflecting on what you just said, it definitely is something that I've found. So on VoxDev, we have these VoxDev lists where we ask people to summarize evidence across like a topic. And in the first draft of those, like almost always, the senior academics writing them are very hesitant to say, okay, we've reviewed all of this research. What do we actually think? And it takes a process of kind of back and forth of edits and trying to kind of tease out of them. You don't have to say like you should do this 100%, but what do you actually think after having reviewed all of these papers and all of this evidence? So yeah, it's definitely, and then there's some who aren't afraid to do that as well. So Mpumi,
Yeah.
The statement is this: policymaker. Oh, that was the last statement. Education policy decisions reflect the takeaways from long-term research evidence on what works in education.
I am giving it a 6. At least it's not a 5. And my reason is because I think of the evidence in categories. So the yes part is a lot of work that's been done on the continent on pro-poor spending is based on evidence. There's large ongoing decades worth of work that says things around distribution, access to resources matter for the poor, etc. And in the case of South Africa, you've seen a retention of a ongoing pro-poor spending pattern, even in the midst of economic reform or challenges. There's been 30 years of no fees and increasing no fees for the majority of schools. So policies like that for me mean there's still a reference to long-term policy contributions that have been made. And then more localized responses to evidence have been a response to poor performance. So international assessments often bring much needed attention to low learning outcomes, and then you see a response. And so we've had in South Africa a ministerial review that followed massive plunges in South Africa's performance. It took 2 years to implement the things that came from that ministerial reform, but it had 4 specific things to be done: workbooks that need to be distributed to every single child. That's been done, and it's now maybe in its 10th year of every year being supplied. Second aspect is introducing assessments, both universal assessments and a sample-based regime. That was done. Unions protested. It's been rolled back, but that second part was done. And 2 other aspects of that, very clear, here's what's wrong, here's what needs to be done, and then it was done. But the parts where I think my answer is no, we don't follow the evidence, is when you start getting more specific on what's happening in the curriculum in particular. And here, the experience of outcome-based education was the worst thing that happened to South Africa, in my opinion, in terms of curriculum, and even current conversations about competency-based curriculum. And robotics, and all of those components might have evidence that comes from the global north or that works in another context, and are often recommended actually by international organizations or funders, but haven't been thought through for the 80% majority of children that were being served. Those ideas sound great for the 20% of fee-paying, highly resourced, electricity-connected people with tablets in their classrooms, but often they become the ideas that dominate the minds of most people. They seem like we're catching up or keeping up with the rest of the world, and that's the thing we do to our detriment. So I think there is a disproportionate influence in terms of curriculum reform in particular that's based on poor evidence or evidence that's out of context.
Thank you. Okay, so Miriam, given that a program or an intervention is effective and evidence has shown that, creating popular narratives is more important than presenting that evidence in building support for policy.
Great.
If I'd been asked this question like 10 years ago, I would have said 1, because who does not like confidence intervals and p-values, right? But after being an academic for several years and wondering why all these groundbreaking things we're doing were not changing the world, I moved into programming. I was like, let me go do RCTs in an organization that is happy to make changes. And looking back, I realized that my answer should be 7. I was surprised because I gave it a 7. I think in summary, if you don't know how to tell your story in a language that people understand, then your story dies with you. And I think that is what we are struggling with as researchers, not the publish or perish ones. There's a group of researchers that it's publish or perish. You do what you do and hand it in. But there's a group of researchers who actually do want to change the world and don't understand why their standard deviations are not changing the world. It's simply because we are going into spaces and speaking in standard deviation language and nothing is going to change. And what I've realized over time, even in the place I work with GiveDirectly, and I went there, I said, I'm going to change this place. Cash is the most researched aid intervention. Like, who doesn't know that? And I walk into the space and people still wanted to do what they wanted to do, right? Irrespective of the evidence. Until I got to a place where I began to tell the story of what cash does. So if you don't have someone to help you tell the story, many of us researchers don't know how to tell stories. So we need to invest in storytellers. Just look at the examples around. Let's start off with cash, right? Most studied aid intervention. We have that everywhere and GiveDirectly. But if you look at the world right now, how many policy makers have taken up cash as the mainstay for poverty alleviation or for humanitarian response, in spite of all the RCTs that we have? Nobody is telling the stories the right way. But the narrative around cash transfers are 2 things. Cash makes people lazy. Cash makes people take alcohol. And everyone in every policy space is going to throw that back at you, in spite of all the evidence that we have that says it is not true. Look at vaccines. Look at anti-vaxxers. My background is in medicine, and one of the biggest papers that came out several years ago, I think it was in the Lancet, was the relationship between vaccination and autism. That paper was revoked. The authors, the PIs, lost their licenses and everything, but nobody cares about that because the anti-vaxxers have a better story to tell. And so as academics, we need to learn how to tell stories. We need to get people on board telling stories. Times when we have gotten storytellers on board, we've brought them in at the last minute, right? The researchers tell us the results are ready to publish, and then we get a storyteller. They're like, what the heck is this? And then we're trying to feed them with the information to feed them with the stories to tell. I think we need to be involving storytellers from the very beginning. Why is this thing a big deal? Why do we want to study it? How are we going to study it? Let them begin to tell the story and prepare an audience for the final results. That way, when the results come with a popular narrative, it is more likely that people are going to pick it up. It might not be policymakers immediately, but it might be the general population, the beneficiaries of the program. They will begin to talk about the results in their own way and force policymakers to change things in the direction that they want it changed. So my answer, once again, surprised myself. It is a 7. Evidence without a good narrative is useless.
Great. So I'm now going to ask a couple of questions, kind of following up on that, and then be sure to be thinking of some questions because we will be coming to the audience soon. So one thing that Stefan Durkon, who's over there, has talked about quite a lot is this idea of second best advice. Don't worry, Stefan, it's not a controversial one. It's the idea of second best advice. So basically, instead of offering the perfect technocratic solution to a problem, first you have to think about what the policymakers' constraints are. They probably don't want to do something that's unpopular, that might lose them votes, that they don't have money for. And given those constraints, you then think about what the best solution is that they will take on board, that's palatable to them. So I was wondering if that's something that anyone on this panel would like to come in on in terms of their own work or their own experiences working in research policy and kind of what that looks like in practice. So that's open to whoever wants to come in. I guess, Justice, you want to?
But before I go there, you still have to confirm that you need cash to buy beer, right? Okay.
Where are you taking me?
No. Okay. I just wanted to set that straight, right? Okay. No, on a more serious point, So I think it's an important point, right? So over the past 2 to 3 years, I've had the privilege of working with chief economic advisors to heads of states in Africa. And to be honest, I've learned a lot. And I agree, they don't care about your confidence interval. And for them, a lot of them are people who have done economics to the highest level, right? Were once university professors and have transitioned to the other side. And one of the things they will tell you is that even them, they see their job as firefighters, not necessarily people who can actually go there and tell the principal that I think you should do A, B, C, D, and that's the end, do it. Right? Because in the real world, let's be real. Politics is king, right? Everywhere there's politics. And before any decision a government takes, it's a political decision, right? And let's all remember when COVID came, right? And I remember this classic example in Ghana. So there was a debate in the news. The Ghana Medical Association said, President, you must shut the economy now, otherwise all of us will die, right? The business community said, hell no. How do you shut the entire economy? What happens to businesses that are struggling, right? Now, each of these groups in their own right were correct. From a medical or a public health standpoint, once you shut the economy down, you reduce the extent of contagion, right? But then the business community too were right, because if you shut the economy down, what happens to the informal market workers, right? And there are some people that if they don't go to the market today, they are not going to eat. Now, a policymaker will, even if the policymaker is a public health professional, will have to think about different sides of the argument, not just what one group of I say professionals are telling him. He must think about what the political scientists are also going to say, right? And mind you, whilst all these professional bodies were talking, the parties, the ruling parties also, the political advisors are also there looking at, look, if you do this, this is likely to be the political implication. And mind you, it was an election year, right? The point is that before a policymaker implements something, they have to look at the various means, right? All the options. And sometimes some option might be the best, right, on paper, but the political situation on the ground makes it almost impossible to implement it. And I think we all know that we don't live in a first best. And I think recently we might agree that we don't even live in a second best. And so I think going back to your point, it's more about we also trying to figure out what is really achievable within the constraints that we are operating in, right? And maybe that might not necessarily be the job of a researcher, right? I think that is why a researcher must play their role, be true to science and tell them what the science is. Even in the policy space, you have technical advisors that are supposed to synthesize all the various arguments and tell them on the balance of things. I think this is perhaps what you're supposed to do. But as researchers, even if we think that the science is correct and the policymakers don't implement our policy to the letter, we shouldn't be discouraged and don't think that our research is useless, because the real world is much more complicated than the RCTs and the regressions that we run. By the way, I have nothing against RCT. Yeah, that's okay.
And Ranil, did you want to comment on that as well?
Anyone else want to go?
I can go.
Well, yeah. Go
Sure.
ahead.
So yeah, I agree with that, especially if the debate is between the best evidence and an action, which is often how I think academics can see it. If you're not doing the very best thing, everything else is useless. And then as a policymaker, you're stuck. That means then you don't act. You continue with more of the same. But if you are able to get to a second best possible option, that takes you much further than inaction. And I think we've seen this a lot with people coming to us with brilliant ideas that are unimplementable because of the ratio, the cost, the system you need to use, etc. doesn't make sense. And so the very first questions we will ask is, yeah, what's the impact, but what's the cost? And it's things like that need to be thought through from the design phase as much as possible. Yes, you want to prove your concept and whether this thing can have an impact, but it's also, can it have an impact at scale at a reasonable price? We've had to think about it in terms of coaching ratios. So someone saying the ratio of a coach to teachers is like 5 schools per coach. At what cost? And how many coaches are we going to have? Where will we find these coaches? Whereas a worst case scenario also won't have an impact, but maybe one coach to 10 schools, double what you think is ideal, but something that still moves the needle is maybe where we best are placed to act. So yeah, definitely.
So yeah, what I was going to say was, I think policymakers' objective functions are really, really complex. They're trying to do lots and lots of different things at the same time. And very often they are juggling objectives that are mutually contradictory. And they have to do things that there are non-linearities. There are some things that just have to be satisfied and some things where they're trying to maximize and so on. And I think one of the things that I worked with Stefan for many years when he was advising government, one of the things that I learned from working with Stefan is that you need to invest a lot in listening to people and trying to understand what they're trying to achieve. And a lot of that will be unsaid. There will be a lot that they will not explicitly tell you that they're trying to do. You know, I've never met a civil servant who says like, okay, I've got 3 objectives here. I want to sort of improve learning. I want to have, be able to get home every evening by 6 o'clock. And I want to get my next promotion within the next 3 years, right? At least one of those things will be unsaid. And you have to sort of understand that, because actually, ultimately, you know what you were saying about sort of actually making sure that things can be implemented? This is the thing that policymakers care about. Can I do it at a large enough scale for it to matter? And can I do it in such a way that once I've done it, I can basically ignore it? I can forget about it and it will run by itself, right? This is totally different to your pilot studies where you've got like 4 researchers, including a tenured professor at like a top 5, thinking about how is this working? Let me check in on the implementation. You know, let's spend another 3 months just making sure that our intervention is just right. That's not how we do anything. We don't have that much time. So I really like, I don't know if Noam's in the room, but Noam Angrist has done this sort of work which looks at what happens when you try and take these beautiful, brilliant pilots and try and scale it through systems that are designed to operate at large scale from the start. And very often the results look totally different because those systems, it comes back to what Herbert Simon said, attention. Those systems don't have enough people who can pay enough attention to troubleshoot as things are going on.
If I could say something really quickly, just loved everyone's answers. But I think depending on second best is determined by the urgency. So how urgently does this policy have to be made? We've seen like in humanitarian situations where the rule is just something quick and dirty, like get us something to help us make a decision now. And not just in humanitarian settings. I was having a conversation with Dennis yesterday for this big RCT that he's helping us do in Malawi. And being an academic, he says we need to do this thing right, like get the data right, get the decimal points in the right place. But then in truth, the organization needs to fundraise for this project and they need the data now. And so coming to a place where we say, okay, let's make sure the academic bit is done really well so that 5 years later, we'll say it was a really well done job. But in the meantime, for the urgent needs now, let's get someone to quickly look at the data and tell us the trends that they're seeing, and we will use that. So I think the urgency matters a lot. Look at things like the pandemic. Countries were shut down, like in Africa, because Italy and the US had shut down. So we also shut down, the economy shut down, everything shut down. But in reality, if we had taken the time to generate evidence, maybe there was no need for most of the African countries to shut down because the pandemic in Africa was essentially different than in the rest of the world. But the situation was urgent. We had seen something happening elsewhere. And so decisions were made based on that. But there are going to be things like poverty alleviation. It is important, but it is not something that should happen like right now. Some of these take time, right? And so this allows us time to do all the studies that we need to do, have them replicated in multiple places and say, this is the evidence that we have. Now let's take these to scale. So I really believe that the level of urgency should determine whether you're going to go with second best or whether you're going to wait for the Sheraton level results. I'm assuming it's one of the best hotels. So.
Great. So now I'm going to ask a question about what people in the audience who have been doing research might be able to do. But I'm aware that you might actually disagree with the premise of the question, so feel free to push back on it. But say, for example, you're someone sat in this audience and you've done your research, you've come away with what you believe to be kind of an interesting policy finding, something that is relevant and that you think shows somehow that things can be improved, what are your next steps if you're trying to actually turn that into impact? Is there things that you can do as a researcher, as an academic, that are realistic but also could potentially lead your research to having impact? A hard question, but I'll see if anyone wants to go.
Yes, is it ready?
So I think to the best of our abilities, if we can, right from the inception, if we could partner with the policymakers right from the inception, because they value a lot of a sense of ownership, right? So if they partner with you from the beginning, they feel like this is something that is not alien to me. This is something that we have made inputs into it. And so it becomes easier to really more or less adapt the findings of the report or the paper that you've done. But again, that is probably a first best, right? I mean, in the real world, we all pull our data from either the DHS or wherever we might, and then we run our core results, and then we think, okay, maybe this is really important. Now, I think one of the things also I've realized is that sometimes backdoor really matters, right? Meeting people one-on-one and having an interaction. I mean, developing a network really, it's important, not just to be able to access data, but also sometimes to make sure that, I mean, it increases the uptake of the findings of the report or research that you've done. Now, that is probably the second best. In the third best is probably where majority of us find ourselves. I think what we can do is really try to, aside publishing our paper in a journal or wherever it might be, if we can find some of these popular science outlets to be able to summarize the findings of these research. Because somebody might be driving home in the traffic in Lagos or in Accra and might be listening to a podcast, right? Or someone might read a blog and say, oh, I think this guy in this department this is something that might be relevant to the person, right? And then sharing it across. But also, I think it's also an important point for a lot of non-academic institutions to also start thinking about how do we join forces to make sure that we create platform for which there can be easy sharing of materials, right? Of course, vetted materials that becomes easier for policymakers to access.
Right. If I could jump in, I think these are really, really good points. And the strongest one, which is second best, because the best is to get, once you think you have a design that you think is going to solve some of the world problems and need policy to be involved, it's really important that you get the policymakers involved from the beginning, because sometimes the design that is perfect for an academic is not what is perfect for the policy person. So get them on board and have them advise you on how to even design the study and where to run it. But I think second best, the value of networking, it just cannot be under, I can't emphasize it enough. And the networking should be outside the academic circles, because in academia, it's like we get worse each time, right? There's now a level called implementation sciences. So after several RCTs have proven that something works, the next level is like, okay, let's do implementation science before we can even get to translating evidence into policy. So speaking to people outside academia, people who are influential, whose voices can be heard in the policy spaces is really important. And for the young people who are at this conference, this is where you make these networks, right? You know how amazing it is to just get your phone and WhatsApp someone and say, I've got these results. I think it's going to be important. And that person sits in the World Bank. It starts here. So the networking is absolutely critical. I think the other thing is creating a narrative. Start with creating a narrative early, because even when someone listens to a podcast, if there's no strong take-home message in a language that they understand, then it's going to be one other podcast that was listened to. So just creating a narrative, like from the very beginning, is going to be really important. Because for you, it may sound like this big deal. Have we all had that experience? So something sounds like a huge deal, but when you talk about it to someone, you also wonder, was that a big deal? It didn't come out the way it was in my head, right? So creating that narrative, convincing yourself about the narrative, speaking to people and letting them begin to tell you your story in a way where you're like, oh my gosh, that was really smart. I think that is important.
If I can jump in on narratives, I like what you're saying. But I think our experience has been that catastrophizing language is not helpful. True. So I'm tired of hearing about the education learning crisis, etc. Like, yeah, it's bad, but it's not a crisis. Kids are in school. Like that can be alienating. And I understand why that kind of language would be used to make a point about why this is an important thing. But we've been in a catastrophe for years now. It's an ongoing catastrophe. So thinking about that kind of wording and who you're speaking to, I think makes a difference when you're engaging people and wanting them to listen to you, and being careful to not always be in crisis. Everything can't be a crisis. Then, it's like if everything is urgent, that kind of language. And then I think depending on your actual sphere of influence, sometimes the minister's elevator pitch is not your best bet. The minister gets tons of things pitched to them all the time. And you have 3 minutes to pitch it to them anyway. So the details of what you want to do, might not be best placed there unless you have, an ongoing audience with them. It might actually be more middle managers, people who actually own the budget, who sign off, more operational, more bureaucratic, not politicians, that are people who over time understand all the things that would need to be changed, and are people that you might want to engage more long term. Yeah. And then maybe a last one is, sometimes I think I've read papers that don't actually know what the policy is. So they speak about like a policy question, or like, this is policy relevant, as in, I can imagine this is a problem in society that society should care about. But if you ask them, so which exact bill is this one in? Or which line item in the budget do you want me to respond to? They've no idea. And so once I think you've developed your interest, you think this is useful, it makes sense to invest in the actual government documents. They actually produce annual plans. They have annual reports. This is the actual policy, etc. And then that helps with like knowing the timing cycles, knowing that the problem I'm helping you solve is 3.1 and 7 and 9. And a lot of the time, if you can make things that simple for people, this is exactly what I'm trying to help you solve. It's easier to take it up rather than they have to now think through what exactly you're talking about and where to place it.
Yeah, I just so that not everybody on the panel is agreeing with everybody else. Like sometimes the answer is just do nothing and don't talk to anybody. Because actually, like there's a general equilibrium problem here. I can't think of anything worse than if next week 300 researchers send emails to me or my boss saying, I have the answer, and they've all got a different answer to the same problem. But no, in all seriousness, not every finding matters. And I mean, honestly, if I'm totally honest, I've sat in far too many seminars where at the end of the seminar, I thought, well, that's a really interesting paper. It's going to be published really well. I don't think it matters very much, but wow, that was cool. I can't believe they found that. And so that's fine, right? You're advancing science. That is okay. You might have made a methodological contribution. You might have solved some sort of puzzle that's been bothering somebody. And maybe someday you or somebody else will build on that to find something that does matter. And that's okay, right? Not everything matters. But when it does, I think the two things, like the things I've been hearing are absolutely right. Talking to people is really, really helpful. Most people, and certainly in policymaking circles, do not have time to read 58 pages plus 300 online appendices. So having a chat with somebody is very useful. I agree with the idea of like, if you want to be influential, use narratives. But here's the thing, it's like, not everybody who uses narratives well should be influential.
True.
So, I mean, be right. That would be the first thing I say. Be right, then be influential. But it's hard to know if you're right.
So I actually have a question for the policymakers on the panel, because it looks like maybe I started it. It looks like we are shifting the burden all on the researchers. What is the role of the policy makers themselves, the government departments, in trying to make sure that, shouldn't they have maybe a department or one or two people that try to go out there and look for the best relevant, information or research that can help them really implement the proper or the best policy, if really their objective function is to look for the best and to do the best of it all? Not sure if I made sense, but yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you said it earlier, whether it's technical advisors or some kind of policy translators that understand both the research and bureaucratic processes. So yeah, I think that is often the gap. But it is important. And ideally, the government should be setting its own agenda. Here are the questions we want to answer, or here are the things we want to be efficient in. But that's not always said. Those technical advisors don't always exist. They don't always have the agency or the opportunity to voice what should be a priority. Other things happen. And so I guess to not make it that if there are no translators, no one can do anything until there's that would be where I say, yeah, it's important, but it shouldn't be the constraint that stops us from acting.
That's true. And I think it's really important that even when there are technical advisors in the policy space, they should not lose the connection with the researchers, because there's a risk that the longer they stay with the policymakers, the more their mindset shifts to the policymakers' mindset. So having them in like close connection with people in academia so that they don't forget where they came from in a sense, and remember what their role is in the policy space is really important. So I think going back to the point that we need to be working together, academics and policymakers, like from the beginning, they need to be telling the researchers what is important in the space, and then asking the researchers if they can answer those questions, what it's going to take to answer those questions. But at the end of the day, being in very close contact is important.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that. I also think that those sort of evidence broker type people have two functions. One function is a sort of expertise function, right? They should be the kind of people who can listen to something complex and dense and technical and translate it into something that is sort of intuitive to people. They'll be able to turn a research finding and then use a metaphor to bring it alive to somebody. But the other thing that they do is that they're also solving information asymmetries. Yeah. Like most researchers don't really know the full set of things that the policymaker cares about or the full set of constraints that the policymaker is working under, and vice versa. The policymakers will find it very hard to understand where are the weaknesses or the limits to what the research can tell them or does tell them. I think both of those things really matter.
Great. So I think we will open up to some questions now, but I reserve the right to ask some more myself. So we'll go first with you.
Thanks for interesting discussion. And I think we all, most of us will agree that we're trying to change policy eventually. Yeah. But we've heard now that we have to be good storytellers, we have to be networking, and we have to do, writing blog posts and all of these things. And so all of that is impossible, both personally and I think the resources just aren't there. So I wanted to sort of pragmatically ask you guys who are in this space, what do institutions look like that effectively bridge that gap? Like, we already have many of them and they're represented on the panel, but what else would you like to see in that space that makes that translation of the evidence to the policy and in the opposite direction feasible, so that we don't have to sort of say, you have to do your research and your teaching and tell stories and go on blog posts and talk to media and all these things, which simply I think isn't possible.
We've got a question over there as well, and then we will stop and then we'll come back to you afterwards. Yeah.
Hi, so I guess I just want to put a plug in here for having research teams that involve local collaborators, because I think when I think about, and there's a podcast on this on the CSAE website, and if everybody here listens to it, it'll 10x the number of listens we've had. But the project that I think that I've done that has had the most policy impact is one in Mexico, where one of our collaborators, Dissanayake, has been daily involved in conversations with policymakers. She's been at the table when the labor law was rewritten, and actually the part that we had the most impact on is something that we've yet to get into a paper, partly because the identification of that part is tricky, but the policy impact of it is very clear. Right. And so, the fact that she was there involved in the conversations, I would have never been able to do that as somebody at a distance, even if I've flown in once a month to be involved in the conversations. It's the continuous, discussion and continuous involvement that was really important. So, no one's mentioned kind of local contacts and local collaborators, but I think that's really quite an important aspect of having policy impact.
Absolutely.
So we have local collaborators, and we have what do institutions look like that bridge the gap, because the point is correct that academics don't have any time anyway. So all of these extra things probably are not feasible. And if we're thinking about second best again, what would an institution look like that helps them out?
Can I start on the institution question? Yeah. So I think the temptation is sometimes to think of a formal institution which has like the job of assessing the fit of government policy with respect to evidence or whatever. That can backfire because sometimes those formal institutions can take too purist a view or too partial a view based on the constitution that they're set up with, the objective they're trying to maximize. And that can lead to sort of these artificial restrictions on how the government can act. And it can actually lead to not the second best, but the third or fourth best outcomes. And I think the UK has got a few of those right now. I'm a civil servant, so I'm not going to say any more there. What I really like, the kind of institutions I really like for this sort of thing are actually generally informal. They're opportunities where policymakers and academics or researchers get to mingle much more sort of organically, like not seminars necessarily, although the side meetings around this conference are a really good opportunity for that sort of thing, right? Stopping and having coffee with people and so on, that really helps. But then there are other spaces where you just bring policymakers and researchers together for like a round table, maybe sometimes around like one specific problem that you're trying to make some progress on. And you can bring a range of people. You'll have some researchers, some policymakers, some civil society organizations, but get them in the room talking. And it will you don't have the identification police in that meeting, so it's okay. You could say the things that you believe will really matter, and no one's going to be judging you based on, it's a very different phenomenon presenting a paper to talking to somebody about what you think is actually happening in the world. And I think the more you can do that sort of thing, the better. Really, very briefly on local collaborators, I just really agree. I think it's one of my formative experiences working in development was spending 4 years in the Ministry of Finance in Malawi, working for the debt and aid department there. And I think I learned more in those 4 years about why things happen or don't happen in the case of Malawi very often, than I have in the entire rest of my career, because you just see there's so much nuance and so much that is not visible from the outside that only somebody embedded in the system can really understand.
Absolutely. Yeah, if I could just quickly go, starting with the involvement of the local players, I think that is critical. And we've seen it in GiveDirectly. So GiveDirectly Uganda has been running for about 10 years now. And initially it was just, we would like show up, we do our stuff and we move on. And we ended up being closed down in Uganda and in Rwanda, right? The government locked us up. Who are these mad people bringing money to our people, right? But then as a result of that, we now have dedicated government relations people. And now we're meeting presidents, and now presidents are saying, we agree with you, cash transfers should be the way to go for development or humanitarian responses. So very important having people who belong, in our language, you say the people of the soil, having the conversations with the policymakers, and I 100% agree. Coming to Dennis's point, I work in an institution that has tried to make sure that we have everyone doing all this stuff, and it is very resource heavy. I agree with you, very expensive. We have a research team, so people are thinking about how do we design studies to answer questions, what evidence exists in the world that we should be implementing. We have people who are doing the implementation science in-house. We have the communications team that is doing the narratives. We have the government and external relations people who are talking to policymakers, recently a policy director, but every time, everyone is overstretched all the time. It is very expensive. It is a lot of work. And what I'm trying to say is I'm looking for an answer from this panel, because the reality of implementing all these things we're saying is really quite difficult. Yeah.
So actually, I think I'll start with that. You don't have to do it all alone. And I think so far we've not mentioned one important group, which is the think tanks. So think tanks are supposed to act as knowledge aggregators, right? And be able to do the work, synthesize the hardcore research in a way that, because they deal a lot with advocacy and also deal with policymakers, so that they should be able to synthesize a lot of these evidence and then more or less deliver it onto the policymakers. So I think that is where think tanks should play an important role. Unfortunately, a lot of our think tanks also in the region have become more of advocacy and not too technical, right? And so I think they're also part of the problem. Now, on a more formal thing, so I mean, the network that I mentioned, right, the chief economist of government, what I do, it's basically, so we have a monthly event where we assemble these economic advisors into a monthly webinars and roundtable. And I must say, one of the most well-attended webinar was when I invited Chris Udry to come present, to them to talk about why is, technology adoption in Africa so low. Initially, I wasn't too sure whether they were going to show up, but it's on record to be one of the most well-attended, right? Now, Chris did not come and talk about identification strategy, but he synthesized the VoxDev lit on agriculture technology and then basically pointed out some of the most important issues, right? At the end of the day, a lot of them, one of my key takeaway was that this controversy of a lot of these countries even giving fertilizer subsidies. His point was, you even have to do a soil mapping to really know whether the type of fertilizer you are giving to people in a particular area, is that really is it very compatible with the soil, right? And so all I'm saying is that these are some of the avenues that, exists, and maybe researchers should also reach out more and those that are available to be able to talk to these policymakers. And it will not take a lot of your time because, Edgar, you've done a lot of research, and all that it will take is really sharing your thoughts on some of these. They may or may not take it, but I think it's probably a starting point. And finally, on the local collaboration, I think it's so important, not even on the dissemination part, but even identifying the right questions to ask, right? Because the local people bring context, and they will be able to know, because they live closer to the problem, and they'll be able to know, I'm not sure this is the right way of putting it. Maybe if you add X, Y, Z to it, that will be more relevant.
Just adding to that, I'd say it's important as an academic or institutions, one, to know what you do and what you don't do. Because I think sometimes wanting the policymakers' ear means you do things you shouldn't be doing or you don't know about. But being known for being the people who work on this area, I think over time might take a long time, but you build credibility, reputation, you actually have detailed insights, and are able to be a reliable source for this. And it's a good thing to say, no, I don't answer those questions, ask those people. And I think a further thing there is around, in addition to think tanks, most government systems have embedded ed labs, so people that are mandated to be doing research, evaluation, etc. And a big opportunity would be strengthening those people, collaborating with those people. They are permanent. They don't need additional funding to exist. They keep the mandate going, with or without new evidence. And I'm part of an embedded ed lab, and that's the longest sustained focus we've had on some areas of education, because whether the implementing side of government like me or not, I have to show up at work every week, every day. And eventually the influence then happens, because influence is also not this one-off occasion.
Great. So we had another question there.
Yeah, I think it was partially answered, but I wanted to ask about kind of role of consultants who come with very little, say, rigor or evidence, but they still play a very large role. How do researchers collaborate or / not collaborate with them? How do they do it?
And did we? Yep. So there's one up there. Someone will pass the mic. Thanks.
Fairly specific, but potentially very actionable. The stat that's been bothering me a lot is, maybe you've seen it, somewhat one of you, 65% of the top 5 econ journal African studies are generally in the same 5 countries: South Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and Malawi. Just wondering, I guess, Justice, if you have any different advice from the local collaboration about how the people in this room could potentially diversify that. Because I think it was still pretty concentrated at the conference.
We'll do one more back there, and then we'll stop there.
Thank you. Mine is a quick one to add to the optimism of Miriam. I think I took a sabbatical from the University of Nairobi since and subsequent leave of absence, and all I do is to work with researchers to connect their research with policy. I met a lot of JPAL researchers here. I've worked with the JPAL team working in East Africa, and they know what we did during COVID. A paper just came out during COVID, and we wrote a newspaper article based on that, and it caught fire, and I was invited to TV stations, and I remember the president changed a few things based on that, what you are saying on TV, which was based on our researchers. I have worked as somebody from FCDO is there. Your RISA program, the Research and Innovation Systems for Africa. I led the technical team in that work, and you know what we did with it. We made piloting innovations to determine cost effectiveness and fit for purpose a thing in government. They ran piloted grant challenges for innovations to solve health and agriculture issues, just to understand what is the cost, how can it be made cost effective, and how can it be made fit for purpose. And I can go on and on. I think we have used researchers from MIT working in East Africa to actually work with policymakers and actually bring them into a conversation with policymakers. And we've used their research to actually inform policy and input directly into policy government. I can go on and on. I earn a living doing that. It's possible.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great. So we have consultants, the geographic spread of research, and then I guess a positive message that things are possible.
Can I start with the very last point, that there are people who are actually trying to bridge the gap between researchers and policymakers? It brings me to Nompumelo's comment and said, you made a statement that I haven't forgotten. You said we just need to learn to be patient. So maybe the problem is not that policymakers are not using evidence. We just need to be patient because things in the policy space take their own time. That is also a possibility. Maybe she will answer that. Coming to the role of consultants, I love consultants, but sometimes I think the problem with consultants, and if you're a consultant here, I don't know that you're a consultant, so I'm not talking about you. Yeah. But my problem with a number of consultants is that they don't have skin in the game, right? They are being paid to do this thing, submit it somewhere, and then move on. And I think that is a big problem. I don't know how we can make sure that a consultant, at the end of the day, whatever advice they give, they are sort of liable if it is not implemented. Whatever it is, I don't know what the solution is, but I think that is where the problem is. A number of times, consultants will come in, very great ideas, but they're thinking of it not in the sense of how are we going to implement the solutions that they come up with at the end of the day. So consultants are great, but I think the rule of engagement needs to be better clarified. Once again, I don't have anything against anyone. This is just a personal opinion. Yeah.
Look, consultants are important. Yeah. If you doubt, ask the World Bank. Look, I think the point on the consultants, it's a fair point. And I think it's also a part of the reflection of the issue that we are talking about, right? There is a gap. The gap needs to be filled, and the policymakers will go for whoever they think can deliver the work for. And so I think it's maybe going forward, a lot more people who are technically rigorous will jump into the consulting space and will increase the depth or the quality of the consulting services that is demanded. But the reality is that it's a fast-paced environment, right? And so oftentimes people call on these consultants when they really need something done ASAP, right? And consultants have developed their modus operandi to be able to deliver you whatever you want within the time frame, right? They won't go to a university professor who will say, no, the time frame is too short, blah, 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 blah. The consultants, most of them will accept it, right? And will find what is feasible. And I think they are also realists, right? They know what is feasible within the time frame that they are given, and so they operate in there. Not to hold brief for them, but I think the preponderance of consultants in many of government departments, it's perhaps a reflection of the main issues that we are talking about here. So I'm not sure I have an answer for you, but just to say, at the moment they are filling a gap. On the issue of the publication, I love the statistics, but I think if you slice the statistics, even within those countries, the share of the local researchers in those numbers is pretty low, right? Yeah. And so I think part of it is it's really about how do we all help develop local capacity, right? And I think a convening like the CSAE it's good, as a lot of the young researchers and I'm from the continent come here, they learn, they build network, and that builds their capacity. But the bigger problem is that I think African universities, we need to find a way of helping African universities. The research capacity is low. Let's be honest, it's low. I mean, not that it's low everywhere. I mean, some are really doing well, but others are really struggling. And we need to think about how do we help these African universities to I think a lot of them are still operating in the post-independence mandate, which was mainly about training, I mean, more or less human capital to fill the public service and all that. But 20, 30 years the space has evolved, but a lot of our universities have still not evolved. And so that will require a lot of funding from the local government. International organizations have a role to play. CSAE has a role to play, and I keep picking on Stefan. Let's start rotating CSAE across the region, because the undergraduate students will sit in these. They will meet with good professors. They will learn the apparel trends that people are talking about. That can incentivize them to really think about, okay, maybe I really want to do, more or less take up a career in research.
It's great to well back to pay for it.
Can I just take up that last point? Great things are possible. I've been quite negative on this panel, so I just want to say, absolutely, yes, we do. There are lots of occasions where research has had a very big impact on how governments function, how policy is made. I just want to give 3 quick examples. So one is when I first joined what was then DFID. I think in my first week or two, a business case came across my desk for funding a Millennium Village project in Ghana. And so luckily in the month before I'd joined DFID, I've been to a bunch of seminars. Michael Clements had just been running through London and presenting on, these are all the weaknesses in the studies that are showing, and it really sort of stuck in my mind. So Stefan sent me the business case. He forwarded it to me saying, what do you think? Copied me into the person who was sort of who was making the decisions over it's the business case equality. And between us and the economist who was working on it, we sort of talked to each other, and eventually they agreed, okay, we'll put in some funding here, but the condition is that you've got to have a really, really rigorous, independent evaluation of it. That was basically the last MVP that was ever funded. So, the research did its job there. And research often kills bad ideas. Another thing that we were doing a lot of back then was sort of really small, not very well structured trainings for small businesses. And I think a lot of Chris's work and David Mackenzie, I remember reading a lot of that stuff around that time. And there were these lots of conversations going on inside the department with people saying, but it doesn't seem to work, does it? And, and I know the results are a bit more nuanced than that. I know the results showing that it might work for some people, but it can be a bit expensive, etc. But we really recalibrated the approach in our department to how we do that sort of thing based on the research. And the last one, it's the most obvious positive one, it's the adoption of cash transfers. And it's also related to something else I wanted to say, which is, so we probably don't do cash transfers enough. We probably don't do them quite the best way. But there was a time 15, maybe 20 years ago where there were basically none being funded by donors. And Antonio Barrientos wrote that book, right? About I can't remember what it was called, Just Give Cash to the Poor or something. And I remember so I didn't know this. I wasn't working in DFID at the time, but I recently worked with the permanent secretary from that period who told me that basically every single one of the senior managers read that book. So the other thing I say is write a book. It's a good way of having fun. Stefan will attest to that. But we went from zero to not just funding a bunch of cash transfers, funding loads of the research on cash transfers, to redevelop all sorts of guidance about how you should do them, what are the different dimensions you can, and it made a massive difference to the quality of some of our work. So yeah, absolutely, good things can happen. They often do. It's just that it's not easy, and we can always do better, right?
Okay, so I saw some hands that we didn't get around to. So yeah, so the guy on the third row and then the guy in the stands.
All right, thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. So my question is very direct. I think we've all agreed that research is very relevant for development in Africa. But one thing that I've seen working in this space for a while now is the fact that the government does not have a skin in the game. They all depend on the donor to fund research, and they want to dictate the priority of the research. So as people working in the government, what do you think that could be done for government, especially the policymaker, to begin to think about investing in research, investing in data collection? Because if I get funding from a donor to do a research in a particular area to a large extent, that is going to influence the direction of my work. So, but government to a large extent also want me to do something nimble, something quick, but they are not going to contribute anything. They just want to wait for the result. So I think we also need to think in this direction. So the government also needs to think about investing, prioritizing research if they need something quick and fast to develop. So that's my comment or question.
Thanks. It was very interesting to hear you discussing the political economy of how decisions are made from the policymakers' side. And I want to ask a question about what your perceptions of the political economy of academic research is like, and how policymakers perceive that, and whether you think that the structure of the incentives is good. So I think academia is very hierarchical. Ideas take a battering before they reach the public, and I think in some sense that's good and that's valued because the ideas are tested. But it also concentrates influence and power among certain research groups, among certain universities compared to others, among certain people compared to others. And I'm curious whether you think that this mechanism is bringing the right skills and the right types of people to the attention of policymakers.
Great. So two easy ones then. So the government not having skin in the game or kind of funding it themselves and it coming from donors, the first one, and then academic incentives and the structure of academia.
So I think the question on the funding is spot on, right? I'm not even sure if it's a question, but I think it's spot on. African government need to have a skin in the game. And these days, the skin is money, right? So I did my PhD in Sweden, and when I went there, I was kind of surprised. Like, you could see different government departments launching calls for researchers to come and apply to do research in the area. So if it's the EPA, if it's the energy agency, if it's what, they have dedicated funding that they allocate to, university professors to apply competitively to do research. Sometimes they don't determine the scope. And then sometimes they might say, okay, we have a 10-year strategy in order to inform our decision or our strategy. We want to commission research to be for the researchers to tell us what are the key priority areas, right? But back home in the continent, I don't know for all cases, but I think generically for the majority of the countries that I know, there's not something like that. And so I think the starting point is really about conscientizing these policymakers and the politicians to realize that there's value in research, right? And for me, the good thing is that now I see a lot more people, higher education people going into government, taking up, because I think it's obvious that the most risk-averse people in this world are the researchers, right? Academia is relatively easy. Once you can do your research, you don't have to fight the politics and all that. So we usually stay in our corner. But now we see a lot more PhDs going into government, and I think that perhaps will be the starting point, right? But then it's also, I think there's a role for international organizations to start through the engagement, right? The bilateral engagements with these countries to let them know that maybe now we are funding all this research, but at some point you also have to put some money on the table, right? So that it becomes slowly, these people realize that they have to own the research and they have to put some money, on the table to be able to fund the research that will help them really design the best policies.
Yeah, and I think, but before we get to that point, I think the governments, like how you've said on the continent, let's be very clear, we're talking about Africa in this case. If the governments are not prioritizing research, then it's unlikely they're going to fund it. I think that is the key thing. If they're happy with anything quick and dirty or just expert opinions, not based on evidence, then it's very unlikely that they're going to fund it. But also coming to the countries that are funding research in Africa, usually it's a win-win. It's rarely the case that the funding goes to Africa and the countries that are funding do not benefit anything. And so I think even if governments in Africa are not putting any money or not putting enough money, I think it's just respectful to find out what are the key issues in this country that need to be answered. And can we make sure that those are some of the questions that we are answering in the process, even if the money is coming from us. And then going to the other question about the academic climate, I think, like we all know, the climate in academia is not leaned towards changing the world on the whole. We talk about publish or perish. So no matter how great your paper is, Dennis Yeager has one of the papers I love the most, General Equilibrium of Large Lump Sum Cash Transfers. But Dennis is not going to build his tent there. Like Oxford doesn't care that was a great paper and he has one. Like he has to do the next one and the next one and the next one. And so academia doesn't allow us time to sit down and build narratives and talk about this one paper because you'll not get tenured. So you have to keep publishing. And because of that, researchers, like, you publish a paper, you move on to the next thing and don't spend, even when the results of the paper could potentially be world changing, you don't have the luxury within that institution to spend time on that. And also, I know the more you learn, there's a saying in Africa that the more that you learn, the more you realize that you don't know. And I think that is why researchers are we're very risk averse. You have your results, you have your confidence intervals. Even when they're narrow, you say, what if I did the same thing somewhere else and the confidence interval became wide? And so then you're too afraid to answer that question because the policymakers are asking, what should we do? And you're like, you know what? The confidence interval here was narrow, but it was wider in the other place. So I'm not very sure. So I think the climate of academia makes us risk averse. And so other people who are willing to do stuff with quick and dirty are the ones who are then driving the action at the end of the day. Yeah.
I think just a few additions. There could be a world where international funders have a portion of their funding that's unconditional. So it doesn't all have to be conditional on the research they want to drive. So they have the flexibility to do some of that change. There is also the local donor role. I often find actually local donors that are country-based fund the best research in the country. They are long-term stayers. They're not dependent on a grant or on some application process outside the country. They've made a decision to fund work in that country and therefore are more willing to fund things in the long term. That may be catalytic aspects for funding. There is also, I think, like you said, when international organizations fund things, I've seen good examples of initially saying we'll fund the whole thing, but upfront agreeing with the government, then in year 2, you're funding 5%. Then in year 3, 10%, etc., and not sort of leaving the timeline of one day you're going to fund it, because one day never comes, right? Yeah. So we move there incrementally. On the power dynamics, I think that's a real thing. I think current ecosystems just recreate themselves, and there needs to be a deliberate decision to ensure that there's capacity being built as we work. There'll never be the perfect moment to build capacity. It's always urgent. There's always never enough money, etc. But I know in the case of South Africa, there've been times where we've made a decision to not appoint the best known people to do this work because they will be appointed for the next 100 years if we do that. But instead to say, yeah, let's add another 12 months to producing this piece of work because we're going to be doing a lot more hand-holding, but we think it's worth it. Or saying to the best organization, we want to work with you, but you need to work with these people that we've identified. So sort of forced matching. Those are probably my ideas.
Just one more thing on this sort of political economy of research. So one of the things that you often hear in policy is, especially from academics who are working in the cusp of policy and research, it's like, you've got to be using the best evidence. And it's this real question of who decides what the best evidence is. Are we just talking about what journal you're published in? Right? Because I think, if you've been through peer review and so on, you've seen how the sausage is made. It's not exactly it's not always the case that the merits of an individual paper, completely unrelated to who might have read it or presented it or seen it be presented, determines the publication prospects of a paper, right? There's also a whole bunch of things about what now constitutes sort of the frontier of knowledge, which is a very specific set of methodological approaches, which are very good for answering certain questions, but they're not good at answering all sorts of questions, and sometimes you can do boring or uneventful stuff with, the best methods, which look really good. And so I think from our perspective, when we're asked to sort of think about what research we're going to fund, how we're going to set sort of, the two people sitting behind you can probably tell you more about this, because they actually do this work. But when we're asked to think about how are we going to set indicators for a research project on is the research very good, right? We have to be really careful and really thoughtful about what sort of things we're going to write down, because we don't just want to reproduce more of the same stuff. We want to have sort of diverse voices features. We want to have sort of get the right balance between sort of what is the most rigorous and sort of going to be published in the best papers, which might take also a really long time to happen, versus getting stuff that is useful and good enough to make decisions on the basis of, or good enough to contribute to the decision-making process and so on. So I think there are people in the policy-making world who do think quite a lot about these sort of internal dynamics, but not many of them. For most of them, it's just a black box. There's just basically academics, and then there's research, and they don't really think about all that process. And we just see the outcome of that, which is getting better, but certainly in economics, not a terribly diverse set of researchers and research findings and so on, and viewpoints that are being expressed. So yeah, I mean, it's a real thing. I don't have any good answers, but it's just something that at least some of the people involved in this are thinking about.
Okay, so we maybe have time for a couple of super quick final questions, if we have any. So there's one down here at the front. But yeah, please keep it brief.
Okay, I have perhaps a thought. How can we improve evidence uptake by creating independent research units within government? I think this has worked well in MDBs. You have the IEG at the World Bank that your colleagues in operations has to necessarily engage with, because they have to agree with the board. The board has to advise them on how to improve operations using evidence from the IEG. The same thing is at the UN, the same thing is at DFID, at the time I used to know. The same thing is at my institution, at AFDB. So when we produce evidence, the users, which is the operational arm, has to take it, and they have to respond on how they are responding to your recommendations and your lessons and your findings, right? So the question is, how can we create a governance framework, right? The second one is just a quick one. How can we co-produce the research? One of the lessons to learn from evaluation is that evaluation engages with users from the outset, and they contribute at every stage of the evaluation. And then perhaps a thought maybe is worth considering inviting or creating special panels at this nice event for papers that don't have clean identification strategy, which is really the issue and struggle in the donor community. So we have nice papers here, excellent identification strategies, but you don't get to see the real papers that make policy change at the government level. So I think it would be very good to have this kind of papers going forward.
That's true. Yeah.
Thanks. And was there another hand back there, or no? I was making that up. Okay, so we've got independent research groups co-producing, and a third point that I forgot to note down. So I don't know if anyone wants to quickly step in on that.
No, I think it's an important point, right? So imagine a Ministry of Food and Agriculture, right? I think it exists, but perhaps what they do, what most ministries, at least the ones that I know, is they have an M&E unit, right? That tends to be more focused on tracking the progress of the projects that they are implementing. But I guess your point is, could they be expanded further to really have a research unit? Maybe, maybe not, because I think the research also requires a special skill, right? And so I think I'm not necessarily in favor of government department replicating, universities within government departments per se, right? I mean, there's a role for research institutes and universities to be able to play this. But I guess what could be more feasible, it's having some technical advisors in these government departments that could work with the researchers in academia or wherever they might be to either ensure that whatever research they are commissioning, it's one that will answer the questions that is relevant to the ministry, or even synthesizing some of the relevant research to be able for them to use for policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'll comment a little bit just on the last point that you had. Can we see those papers, the evidence that have actually been translated into policy? I think that would really be great for people to see papers that have been written, and at the end of the day, that these papers were translated into policy, and how different is the policy implementation compared to the way the studies were done. But I think just adding one thing in there, I think as academics, we fear publishing failure. I mean, we talk about evidence, we publish papers that have the good p-values, but we don't talk about the null findings. And then it makes it really hard for policymakers to really believe us, because we're only telling them we are telling them what we want them to hear, and everything else is left under the carpet. So I think as academics, that's one thing that we need to begin thinking about, because the Lancet will not publish a paper of failure, but then we need to find homes for them because they contribute to the bigger story as well. But I should mention that.
I'll be very brief. I think we desperately want to hear failures because we need to know what to stop doing. But the other thing is, how do you co-produce research with difficulty, but it's really worth doing? But not everything should be co-produced with, because, I mean, it will be frustrating for both sides. You have to, put restrictions on how you sort of adapt and change your program if you want to evaluate certain aspects of it. That makes it very difficult for the government, which if it can start seeing that something's not working quite well, it really wants to change it. And it can also be frustrating for the researcher. But there was that paper quite recently, I think it's the Alex Bonajan paper, which looks at the IGC's history of project, and it finds that the ones which were co-produced between policymakers and researchers had a much higher chance of being translating into some sort of policy change than ones that were independently produced by researchers. So there's probably a lot of selection bias in there as well. In terms of the ones you're co-producing probably were already, there's probably something slightly different about them, but it does seem to matter.
And maybe to just add on the embedded ed labs, I think I differ with you there a bit. I think there would be a strength in having good research and evaluation sections within government. I think that the mistake is combining planning and reporting, which has deadlines, and reporting to Parliament with M&E that needs more time and research, etc. But I think what could be done to strengthen that is what we've spoken about, generally improving the overall capacity of who gets produced from universities, what NGOs are doing, etc., so that the people who sit in those positions know what good research looks like and are able to contribute to it in the long term.
Okay, so I think that's all we're going to have time for. I've written here that I need to try and summarise some of the key points at the end, but there was a lot going on. So what I'm going to do is we'll upload the recording, and then I will write a blog. I will write a blog about it on VoxDev, and you can read it there. So that's a little plug for VoxDev as well. And I'd also want to take this opportunity to everyone in the room, if you do have research that you want to give it a bigger platform, please do consider submitting to VoxDev. I mean, it's the easiest. I've got a list now of 700, 800 papers that are ready to someday potentially be on VoxDev. But if you want your research to go to the top, you can submit it to us. We won't. If loads of people submit, it might take us a bit to get around to it, but that is the best way of getting your research on VoxDev. So I just wanted to mention that, particularly to all those based at kind of universities in Africa. We really want to receive your submissions, and I'll be going through after this event, looking at the different people who've been presenting and maybe reaching out to some of you. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that, and now I will hand over to Stefan.
Give me 30 seconds. I'm just gonna So, look, well, we're coming to the end of the conference, and I would first want to invite you to actually applaud our panel.